Another thing I want to show you guys is how to cover up your faces, okay, or your heads. And so one thing that's really important for this process is that we make sure that we keep this thing wet. And again, we talked about it a little bit where I could take like maybe some water and a sponge and just lightly dab it on there. Okay, that's one technique that I could do. The other technique that I would maybe want to do is if I have some sort of a spray bottle, I can just kind of give it a psh, psh, psh from pretty far away to get a nice thin layer of water over top of this thing, and then I'm going to want to cover it. So when I cover it, I want to make sure that it's completely covered, and so I like to use dry cleaner plastic. Okay, we talked about this in that other video. And so what I really want to do is I want to take this dry cleaner plastic or any kind of plastic that I'm going to do, and if I just do this, is that enough, gang? Absolutely not. This is just going to get, like, if I'm going to step away and have lunch, maybe this is an okay thing to do, right? But if I'm going to step away and I want to come to this thing later, I want to add a little bit of moisture, not a lot. I don't want to see a big sheen to the clay, but I'm going to add this over top like this. And then I'm going to tuck all of this underneath. Tuck all of this stuff underneath. So that way it's completely covered, and then I'm going to set it down so that way the weight of this object keeps it all nice and tucked in, so that way a wind is not going to come and blow it away. Nothing like that's going to happen, okay? Notice that I came from the top on this one and went under. If you guys are using the technique where you're going to be building on plastic, I recommend using a thicker piece of plastic so that way you don't get any holes in it down below while you're doing this. Or you can do what I did with the packing tape, okay? And cover the whole thing with packing tape, and that's going to keep any moisture from getting through into the cardboard as well. Also, remember, it kind of blocks off all those marks too, so that I still have those marks to go off of during my building or building the mass portion. And if you're doing it underneath, then what you're going to do is take that and kind of just fold it over, however many times you need to do that, so that way you're able to get this thing covered completely and no air can get inside. I mean, it's not a case of like it's got to be hermetically sealed or anything like that, but it needs to be completely sealed as much as we possibly can get it to seal. Especially, I've heard that we're going to have some Santa Ana winds coming through at some point in time. It typically happens in the fall. So we want to make sure that we kind of protect ourselves from that. Clay dries out. What you don't want to have happen is you don't want this thing to get dry and hard, and then it's going to be much more difficult for you guys to do the subtractive portion of it. And also we want to make sure that we remember that we're going to be coming back to this object afterwards and hollowing it out. And we do not want to be hollowing this thing out when it's rock hard, when it gets to what we call a bone dry stage. Real quickly, I'm going to talk about the stages of dryness of clay. We were just using wet clay. That's not really a stage of the drying process. That's just clay, right? Clay is wet when we use it. There's different types of clay. Some clays are a little bit more wet. Some clays are less wet. They feel a little bit more dry. And then we also have liquid clays that we work with within sculpture and ceramics as well. But we're not working with that liquid clay. We're working with this kind of more pliable, malleable, workable plastic clay. And that term plastic refers to the fact that you can bend it and it doesn't crack. Doesn't mean that it's made out of plastic, because there are plastic clays or oil-based clays that don't dry out, and those are the clays that we're not using. Okay, the first stage of dryness level is a dryness level that I like to call cheese hard. That's where it starts to stiffen up and it starts to get the consistency. It starts to look a little bit waxy. It loses its tackiness. It doesn't feel so wet. And if you tried to push on it, you could push on it, but it gives quite a bit of resistance. Right now, if I pushed on this clay, it just moves, right? You saw me do that in the time lapse as I was squishing all this stuff together. So what you want to make sure, or in that cheese hard stage, the ways to recognize that it's cheese hard is that when you push it, it kind of has a little bit of resistance to it. It's not quite so soft any longer. If you were to take a nail or the end of a pen and kind of poke at it, you could get that to go through, okay? It will make a mark, okay? And it'll be relatively easy for that to happen. Think about a block of cheddar cheese, right? A block, that's the hardness of cheese hard, and that's why I use that term, cheese hard. So, and then the next stage of dryness after cheese hard is going to be a stage called leather hard. And leather hard is where it stiffens up quite a bit more. All right, if I pushed on it, it would have an absolute resistance. It wouldn't move at all. Okay, it wouldn't push in, it wouldn't give any, it wouldn't start to move at all. And if it was a thinner wall, if I tried to do that, it might move a little bit, but then it would start cracking and breaking. In the solid state like this, it's going to be very difficult for us to get, we're going to have an outer layer that'll get to about leather hard. And when we talk about how to hollow this thing out, that's about the stage that we're going to start hollowing this thing out, is when the outside surface becomes leather hard. The inside won't be that hard because it's not exposed to the air like the outside surface is when we allow this thing to start drying out. But that's a long way down the road. So that's leather hard. Leather hard, if we want to still add things to the clay, we can. But the way in which we're going to be adding them is using a process called scoring and slipping, or scratching and slipping. And we're going to talk about that as well a little bit later as we get to adding on these machine parts. We really don't need to use the scratching and slipping process when we're doing and building and making the facial features that we're going to be making. It's really not necessary because we're working with rather wet clay and we're going for soft edges. Right? So if we want to add anything in the leather hard stage, we really have to scratch and slip it, otherwise, or score and slip it, otherwise it's not going to stay in the firing process. Okay? And then after leather hard is the stage of dryness that's called bone dry. And we're on our way to a bone dry piece when we start to see a haziness start to appear on the surface of the clay. You guys are using a dark brown clay. I'm using a gray clay. It looks gray right now, but it's actually going to fire white or lighter, much lighter than that. And your dark clay is going to dry quite a bit lighter than the color that you see it, but then it's going to fire much darker. So with your clay, you're going to start to see a whitish haze or a whitish film start to show up on the outside of the clay when we get to the drying stage of this object. Or if at any point in time we're making and we start to see that, that's a pretty good indicator that we need to do some massive re-wetting. And if you get to that phase, please send me a message and we can hop on Zoom or something like that, and I can talk you through how we can potentially kind of bring that clay back to life like a Frankenstein style situation. It becomes very difficult to be able to do that if it does get to that point, so try not to let it get to that point unless we're purposely trying to dry out that piece of clay. So then that's once it gets past that, it starts to become bone dry. When it's completely bone dry, it becomes, instead of cold to the touch, you guys will notice that when you're working with the clay, your clay will be cold to the touch. When it becomes bone dry, it will actually start to become room temperature. So if it's cooler out, it's going to feel cooler, like the air temperature. If it's warmer out, it's going to feel warmer, like the air temperature. So in those bone dry stages, clay is a very good indicator as to what the temperature of the air is. Okay? So when it becomes in that bone dry stage, that's the most fragile that your object is. It's basically at that point just a bunch of dirt, very clean dirt, suspended in air. There's no binder in clay. We don't use any binders in our clays because there's no reason to use that binder, because the binder itself actually is a material called silica, and that silica that's in the clay, it is going to actually be the binding agent essentially when it goes into the kiln and it gets really hot. What happens in that kiln when the clay gets really hot is it goes through a process called quartz inversion. And quartz inversion is where all the silica molecules form a crystalline matrix. They form bonds with one another, and that's what turns it into ceramic. Right now it's going to be clay. When it comes out of the kiln, it will be a material called ceramic. It's no longer clay. It's gone through an irreversible change, or what they call an irreversible change. Theoretically, it's an irreversible change, but not necessarily, because if we wait about 20 or 30,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 years, it's reversible, but it's just not reversible within our lifetime, because clay itself is decomposed granite. So it's basically rock that's been decomposed, that has floated down and gotten displaced from water moving it through river systems or through rain runoff to go to a lower point and those clay deposits to be able to form. So anyways, it's theoretically, in our lifetimes, it's considered an irreversible process, but in all, you know, geologic time, essentially, it is a reversible process, but very, very long period of time that it takes for that to occur. So that's how we cover our stuff up. That was kind of a long-winded answer as to the dryness stages and how clay gets fired and whatnot. If you ever take a ceramics class, you're going to learn a lot more about that. This is probably going to be one of maybe 2 projects that we maybe even use clay in the sculpture class. The remainder of the projects are going to be much different, and they are going to include other things, but potentially we may come back to clay, or some of you may choose to use clay for a certain part of your process, right? Just realize that if you are ever going to use clay, or if you're thinking about using your clay to make other objects, this clay that we're using has to be fired. If it doesn't get fired, it is just, if you put it out and, you know, you could run it under the sink and it'll just start to go away. It'll start to erode. It's just dirt. You know, it's just clean dirt, just earth minerals that have been put together in certain proportions to make a certain type of clay that can be fired to a specific temperature to give us the result that we want, right? So if you end up making something out of this clay at a later date, it's something that has to be fired, and it's very difficult to get this stuff fired outside of the school setting. So if you end up using your clay for a further project, just realize it has to be fired, and also it can't be solid, right? We're making a solid object here, but then remember, we're going to be hollowing it out, and we'll talk about that at a later date as well. This is a multi-step process, takes weeks to get this this face portion done, and realize that we're going to be working on this for quite some time. All right, so that is what we're going to be doing. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email or shoot me something in the chat in the Canvas shell, and I'll be giving you guys another demonstration about how to do a couple more things. If you get ahead of yourself and you want to check out some ways to sculpt the eyes or sculpt the lips or sculpt the nose, well then, hey, you know, hop on YouTube and check it out and see if you can find anything. And if you want to, post it, right? I'm probably going to be putting up a discussion board for us to be able to put some stuff up there. Number 1, for our progress, and number 2, if you want to add anything extra or anything that you found. Cool. We will get another demo here pretty shortly. Thanks.